North Korea is not communist. It's not even socialist. It is a monarchy controlled by the Kim dynasty. And you can even argue that it has some fascist tendencies within their government. And it's almost like a quasi-theocracy in its function, with the only necrocracy in the world, where the dead rule the country. The first of the Kim dynasty still technically is the supreme leader of North Korea, is still in charge. Similar to the Aztec civilizations, where the dead still participate in government despite being dead. People trying people Marxists, and more specifically the more hardcore Stalinists, and to an extent some Maoists, but that is debatable, is they defend North Korea as a virtue of the self-reliance against imperial warmongering. While in fact North Korea itself has the participated colonial imperial elements within its own right. Technically speaking, people think there are only two Koreas, North and South. But technically there are three Koreas, North, South, and Yanping, China. And we need to talk about that North Korea, despite being oppressed by the Western world in all measures and being a victim of genocide during the Korean War, where 25% of the North Korea's population died in the war by the genocide committed by the United States, North Korea itself has become an authoritarian state and suppressed any left-wing news that isn't strictly a Leninist approach or a Stalinist approach of government. We have anarchists who have lived there for centuries, and they have been oppressed and persecuted. The first time the Koreans became their own independence was under an anarchist society with around 2 million people under anarchist communism. The image you see in the background of me is one of the people who were part of this society, who were oppressed by the combined might of the communists and the capitalist forces, similar to what happened to revolutionary Spain and Ukrainian free territories. And despite Trump actually praising the Kim dynasty for their authoritarianism, which Trump, who's a fascist, wants to be a strongman, but he has, since the first presidency, condemned on multiple occasions. If they try to lie about specific living conditions in North Korea in areas where that's not really the case, or CIA officials who contradict Donald Trump's statements about Kim Il Sung as a very rational actor, right? Or people forget that it's like, oh, if they from some Marxists, like, oh, if the North Korea is police inequality, while in reality the official newspapers are very fascist, and like in their articles. One famous example is from one of their primary North Korean newspaper, is the back in 2006 said that money ethnic, money racial theories amount to genocide. Yes, and I can even read it. It's from the newspaper, North Korea's official primary newspaper. They say that South Korea is a ridiculous movement taking whose sole objective to castrate their people and their essential qualities to implement a multi-ethnic, multiracial society. And like they're against the concept of mixed bloodlines, including Americans and the worst, to defeat the isolationist nationalism they have embraced to this ignorance of multiculturalism. So yeah, like it is very fascist in their conception of race. Their philosophy and future takes inspiration in many cases of the Japanese fascism. This state-sponsored philosophy there's a combination of state atheism, while in fact it's a philosophy mixed with national mysticism, Maoism, and third world monarchism and fascism. It is ascribing supernatural feats and deity status to great leaders. The leader must be worshipped as a god, or at least a superhuman superior to any other human. Thus, not all religions permit it, even though there do exist other religions. And, and bans the denial of the greatness of the leader. Not only the leader should be worshipped, but also his grandfather, despite being dead, is still the leader of the country. Anyone that denies the godly leader should either be put to death or concentration camp, not just by the person who committed a crime, quote unquote, but the rest of the family that span out to three generations, similar to the Old Testament when they made that similar statement. They teach at school that the kings are gods, and one of them had never defecated, or he was born under a double rainbow, or when he was 6 months old, he can walk and talk, and he changed his moods would affect the weather. But that doesn't mean South Korea is any better. South Korea has a long history of dictatorship from its foundation until the Kwincheon the uprising, where they established an anarchist society within the city before being massacred. And then the last president of South Korea, who was a fascist who tried to do a coup but failed, is the but North Korean defectors, they're not very trustworthy source because many people get paid for exaggerating lies. In fact, there's been many cases that many North Korean defectors want to go back to North Korea because the living conditions in South Korea and the racism and discrimination against them is so severe. Some people even die of hunger without access to basic needs in South Korea, despite being defectors. And again, going back to the defectors, they get paid for lie. A Swiss businessman has stated that his name is Felix Ab, that North Koreans that defected to South Korea increasingly biased, that 70% of the defectors in South Korea are unemployed and they're studying sensationalism to make money off of it. And people forget that the majority of people who defected are from the North Hamgyong province, which is the poorest province in North Korea, which these defectors already come from poverty, and the people there already have a grudge from the people who live in Pyongyang and other places, which are richest places in North Korea. According to Hyun Gun Lin and Shin Yoon Son, said that some defectors embezzle or fabricate stories to sell books and make documentaries. There are many inconsistencies in stories which makes it worse and their reliability. Cash payment for interviews are standard. The more exclusive or emotional story is, the higher the payment. And even South Korean have a concern about the unreliability of the testimony of the defectors. In the biggest discovery, some people who fled to North Korea actually want to go back, like I mentioned earlier, because they believe they were better off financially and medically in the North. The unemployment rate among North Koreans in the South is 3 times the national average. A man named Mr. Son, who was one of the defectors, suffers debt problems that he lost his fridge and washing machine, and is applying to the South Korea government for official permission to return to North Korea. Here in his words, and I quote, over the years, I noticed that people in different historical factors here in the South, the material circumstances they grapple with, and there have been days when I ask myself, I choose to come here in the first place. Whatever a North Korean defector goes, he could face difficulty and discrimination. Discrimination of based from your own people can feel like a colder. End quote. Remember the news talking about North Korea claims they discovered a unicorn? I think you have to know this one already. That if you do, that it was a lie. In reality, the discovery of the unicorn is a term of the ancient capital of Dongguyeon of Goguryeo. Another thing that you don't hear from mainstream media is that North Korea actually offered to disarm its nuclear arsenal in returning for peace, but the U.S. and the United States and South Korea refused. Remember that. And this is during Donald Trump's first presidency. North Korea told the United States of Korea, we want peace and we are willing to remove our nuclear weapons. And the US refused the peace. Now look at the Iran, who doesn't even have nuclear weapons to begin with. The U.S. lie about they have nuclear weapons because they want to have all the resources for themselves. So even when they agree 0% uranium enrichment, which is insane, and they agree to it, America still started the war. So, like, remember, Trump, even in the first presidency, is not reliable. And during his presidency, they did a secret U.S. Navy SEAL Team 6 mission to infiltrate North Korea to spying and put hidden microphone to see what the leader was saying. But it was a complete disaster. Many videos and stuff like that are going to be in the description. But regardless, Western media will use certain words that don't mean anything just to demonize the country. Like, for example, North Korea is a rogue state, has prison camps, has death squads. You know, instead of a country with prisons, military, and suddenly all the brutality the United States doesn't seem quite as bad. Even though the United States has the largest prison population in the world, Lord, it has 2 million prisoners. Most of them are African American or other marginalized groups. In fact, there's more people in U.S. prisons than the Stalin gulags at its peak. You know, a great example of this is from the chat of Carroll, and I quote. But with the Cold War climate still prevailing over the Korean Peninsula, it is important to remember that the anonymous sources behind the sensationalism are sometimes motivated to leak stories about North Korea for ulterior motives. North Korea too has to know the circulating false information from unofficial channels to influence the South Korean news agency. Further, muddling the waters, and because Pyongyang rarely bothered to correct even the most outrageous of stories, the psychoanalysis news it read about North Korea would likely to continue to perpetuate. End quote. Here is another example quote from The Guardian. In January, the TPKRK, the government released a video claiming that the show Shin's father denouncing his son's stories as fake. When questioned, Shin's confessed that parts of his accounts were also inaccurate, including the cessation of his times in Camp 14, the infamous labor camp for political prisoners, at the age at which he was tortured. Shin is not alone. Another North Korean, Lee Sung-ok, offered testimony to the U.S. House of Representatives in 2004 describing torture and killing of Christians in hot iron liquids in North Korean political prisons. There are questions to be asked about how heavily outsiders should rely on defective testimony as reliable evidence. But Lee's testimony was challenged by Shin In-suk, the head of the North Korean Defectors Association in Seoul, which claimed to know firsthand that Lee had never been a political prisoner. And many former TPRK citizens on the website NKNet agreed Lee's accounts were unlikely to be true. Similarly, Kyun Hook told the U.S. Congress that he was an intelligence officer in the TPRK embassy in Beijing. He had witnessed human experiments in political prisons. A critical factor in the U.S. decision to pass the North Korea Human Rights Act in 2004, Hoon's account retold in a BBC documentary in 2004, were later questioned by South Korea's Yonhap news agency, which argued that he never had access to such information. Many years later, Kuhn has since disappeared from the public eye. While there is no doubt the North Korean regime has committed serious human rights abuses, there are questions to be asked about how heavily outsiders should rely on defective testimonies as incredible witnesses. End quote. And there was a great YouTube channel called Jakarta, an Indonesian who records the daily life of Koreans from Pyongyang, the capital, and the largest city and the richest city in North Korea, bringing us sharp views of what it's like, which is just like any other people. While people live mostly in poor middle class or lower middle classes, not different from the Caribbean in many cases. While most people forget that in the early years of the North and South split, it's America were the bad guys in this situation because before the split, it was ruled by a theocratic Japanese empire. But after the split, the North allied to the South to the Soviet Union, made reforms and sympathies fled to the South, but South allied to the U.S. government, expelled the Socialist government, and brought back the Japanese fascists. However, it did not like this, was forced to flee. Sin Yat-sen, the first president of South Korea, who was a strong pro-American view, was a dictator. Political oppression, corruption, and killed around 14,000 Koreans, who we expected to be communists, tortured people who we thought were communist spies, and then sent them to re-education camps, aka concentration camps, and committed the Mongyeon massacre and the Lee massacre. And after all the horror, he was rewarded by a medal by the U.S. Navy Rear Admiral Ralph A. Ofsey. Not only this, but during the Korean War and the fear of communism, that according to General Curtis LeMay said, "We burned down every town in North Korea. We killed off 20% of the population." Likewise, if the prisons in North Korea, but America has the highest prison population, which is kind of hypocritical. Este, but how do North Korean soldiers fight the largest military exercise? How do they feel, my mistake, that the largest military exercise in the world happened twice a year in their borders and the military in question? If the US practice was a mock invasion, intense military drill using all types from foot soldiers, tanks, and helicopters. People on the news keep mentioning the fear of invasion by North Korea, while forgetting the US has invaded pretty much almost every Latin American country ever, and trying to assassinate Castro 638 times, even though he finally died of old age. They will point out that North Korea doesn't have enough food, while there are leaders overweight, while forgetting that other countries have the same problem. According to the World Health Organization in 2017, one in every nine people are hungry or 820 million people are starving, and 850 million children are starving. And most people who suffer this is from Africa, yet to my knowledge, don't talk about as much about African leaders who are doing nothing on this. All these shortcomings are results of international trade. Like the USA, they produce more what they need to consume and produce 50% more of all wheat exported in the world, while North Korea isolates itself, has not had to rely to itself, and before this, during the Cold War, was already a declined state and relying on Soviet imports to survive. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, they stopped all food and fuel imports. North Korea, just before this, North Korea suffered extreme famine, and all it was caused by indirect attack of the hostile world. The government created Office 39. They created companies all around the world to make profit, around the $2 trillion per year, and all this money goes straight to the leader. And this system produced 40% of North Korea's economy, thus becoming state capitalist. America was the reason for the split of the Korean Peninsula to begin with. In the order of John J. McCloy, who wanted to divide Korea, and the Koreans, the reason for the people to refer to U.S. as power because it gave them hope of independence, self-government, and free country, while the U.S. brings the return of the Japanese oppressors, who bring suffering of man and making women sex slaves to please the Japanese and American soldiers. In North, established an 8-hour workday, abolished child labor, and ended 2-week vacations, while in Japanese-ruled South Korea was the opposite. A Cambridge economist, John Robertson, went to North Korea in 1960, declared that the nation is a nation without poverty, while South Korea, a fascist dictatorship, killing hundreds of thousands of people for capitalism in the American empire. South from its inception up to today has used concentration camps on people who are left, who are on the left. Today it's illegal for union to use political activism. It's illegal for Korean political party to have any left-wing views, from democratic socialism to anarchist communism. Censorship ban or remove all left-wing material from books to the internet, and people can be arrested for promoting left-wing views and protesting about unemployment and homelessness. In North Korea, they also do that, but specifically anybody to the left of the Stalinists. The US used South Korea army for the war against communists, like sending Korean troops in Vietnam and being part of the projects as the Pentagon Papers, which the US used the market used to Korean company to, according to Stephen Wonchon, and I quote, Washington injected about $1 million into the RRK from 1965 to 1970, equal to nearly $8 billion in 2018, to cover the cost of the RRK troop deployment to Vietnam. These payments account for an estimated 7 to 8% of South Korea's GDP from 1966 to 1969, and almost one-fifth of its total foreign earnings in addition. Washington supplied the RRK military with billions of dollars of equipment, opening up Vietnam to South Korea's businesses as a market and sphere of investment. Vietnam became a concubination of profit for Korean firms, as the U.S. officials show Korea corporations which contract to support the U.S. war effort. Under U.S. direction, Vietnam soaked up more than 90% of the RK steel export and half of this transportation equipment export. End quote. The US created one of the worst places for labor, using child labor, but the government realized it's a problem and increased and discouraged workers that get being compared to unhealthy work ethic of Japan. And again, Stephen Gowan made this discovery, and I quote again. South Korea worked the second longest hours among OECD countries, with many salaried workers and manufacturing companies working for more than 60 hours per week. Many do not take their paid vacations. A person working a 40-hour work week without vacation puts in 2,080 hours per year. In 2014, South Koreans work on average 2,124 hours more than a full-week excess of a 40-hour work week without vacation, implying that many South Koreans are taking vacation at all or are taking vacation while working punishingly long hours, or both, and the figure was shown from the year 2000, when South Korean averaged 2,512 hours at work per year, or 40% higher than the number of US workers pulled out of the job, and around 80% more than the German workers. South Koreans then worked on the longest hours in the industrial world, which means conditions have substantially improved from when Japan occupied Korea, or Koreans were compelled to toil long hours in Japanese-owned mines and factories. Have long hours made South Korea a marvel of productivity? Apparently not. Despite their lengthy hours on the job, Koreans of the South are less productive than workers in other OECD countries. The RK citizens work long hours, ultimately not to make their lives better, but to enlarge the inherent fortune of pampered sons and daughters of the founder's country, which they have like this untouchable oligarchy and giant conglomeration which dominates South Korea's economy. And the privileged children of Countries' corporate elite use their accumulated wealth accumulated for them by non-toy South Korea to dominate those spaces of the country. Political life left open to the indigenous South Korea influenced by the outside is further influenced by the United States. As a consequence, corporate loyalty exists on a legal and material plane, high above that or otherwise South Korean hoi polloi. End quote. The U.S. extreme sanctions on North Korea since 1948 in order to destroy them economically and label them as isolationists. A U.S. sanction against the DPRK have included limiting on the export of goods and services, prohibition of most foreign aid and agricultural sales, and ban on export-import bank funding, denial of favorable trade terms, prohibition of imports from North Korea, blocking of any loan or funding through international financial institutions, limits of exporting licenses of food and medication for export to North Korea, and ban on government financing of food and medicine exports to North Korea, prohibition on imports and exportation if the transaction related to transportation, a ban on dual-use export, i.e. civilian goods that can be adapted to military purposes, and prohibition of certain commercial bank transactions. The reason North Korea suffered famines in the 2000s is not because of their quote-unquote non-existent socialism, but the U.S. policy of starving people in the North in order to join their capitalist philosophy. Like the words of the former TPRK diplomat, and I quote, "This has a major impact on our economy, and with the disappearance of the USSR, the U.S. moved to a policy of intensification. Believe that our days were numbered. The U.S. intensified its economic blockade and military threat. They stopped all financial transactions between the PPRK and the rest of the world. The US controls flow of foreign currency. If they say any bank will get target section, it does business with PPRK, then obviously the bank has to go along with them. The US issues such an ultimatum in all companies. If they do business with North Korea, they will subject to sanctions by the US. This is still in place. The US government, throughout, they cut economic relations with the PPRK and the rest of the world. We will have to submit to them. The only reason we have been able to survive is the single-hearted unity of the people. The people unite firmly around the leadership. We work extremely hard to solve our problems by ourselves. Blocking medicine in North Korea people are the part of the U.S. economic warfare. The U.S. induced North Korea and back then the Soviet world into military overburden and forced the Soviet Union to spend itself into bankruptcy. In effort to keep up these, it's not socialist and compelled them to constant attack of U.S. and the rest of the world. That doesn't mean that North Korea is peaceful, far from it. Human rights violations are the norm, and the history of authoritarianism is still a problem and must be abolished to free the people. Like I mentioned earlier, the first time Korea was independent was an anarchist society. If the People's Republic of Korea from 45 to 46 was a short-lived, but North and South were slaughtered by the combined forces of Mao's Communist Army in the North and the imperialist fascists in the South at the same time. Similar to if they using state capitalism to do their own bidding for their own aristocratic class. Similar to Laos, which is the most forgotten of the five quote-unquote socialist countries where they use Soviet-style state enterprises. And despite North Korea having the second highest public quota in the world, the first being Cuba and third place being China, many atheists still hold Confucian's views about women, and there are many examples of people living in North Korea, women experience sexism because of the Confucian values still maintained, despite preaching about equality about men and women. And despite the sabotages and what happened in the 2000 famine, right, they combined might of the bad geography that is not capable of agriculture sufficiently and economic sabotage for the rest of the world. But they still maintain to boost productivity surpassing all Southeast Asian countries, and their statistics on nutrition produced economy was superior to Southeast Asia. And the reason many North Koreans stay in the South because there is an economy of human trafficking, which they find North Koreans who live very close to the border or go to China to get a job or family to visit. And these capitalist criminals trying to convince them to go to South Korea for a good job. And when they arrive to the South, they kidnap North Korea, take their passport, and force them to sign a South Korean citizenship. And if they don't, they kill them and possibly publicly call them Northern spies. And many North Korea try to commit suicide out of depression, and they lose their family from the North, which they will never see again. And these victims are not allowed to talk negatively about themselves or get arrested, or many North Koreans die of hunger itself because they do not have money to buy food. While the U.S. committed massacres during the Korean War, sex slaves and many went to North to have a better life. One of the massacres, the U.S. and South Korea had committed atrocities like burying babies alive, or torturing women by burning their nails, or beheading children from Pacific Rim to be massacred. Well, yeah, this is a thing, sadly, in America. It's not different than Japan during World War II in the Korean War. In fact, despite this, they have technological innovation and produce more clean air and electricity in all of Asia, with the exception of China, where there are some respect we should give despite the extreme conditions, something similar to Cuba. And again, despite the world, they can be sympathetic to North Korea, but the Marxist economic research that's not true because all these are state capitalist countries: China, Laos, Cuba, North Korea, Vietnam, because they have markets, and market always needs a state, and by consequence, capitalists. The people don't have automatic vote registration. So by consequence, these countries, especially North Korea, are state capitalists because of their surplus analysis by how the production and distribution of the surplus are organized. Thus, bosses, authoritarian organization of labor, authoritarian distribution of surplus, is organization of producing using the state. This is why North Korea and the other countries similar are driven by the need to plunder these countries of commodities to make up the shortages caused by central planning. A point made by a Marxist philosopher, Castor, who sees the capital nature of democratic centralism, and I quote, let us consider, for example, democratic centralism. It is supposed to function as an ideal Leninist party. That the Central Committee is designed by a democratically elected Congress makes no different sense. Once it is elected, he has complete statutory control over the body of the party and can dissolve the base organization, kick out militants, etc. And that under such conditions, it can undermine the composition of the next Congress. The Central Committee could use its power in honorable ways. These powers could be reduced. The member of the party might enjoy political rights such as being able to form factions, etc. Fundamentally, this would not change the situation, for the Central Committee will still remain an organ that defines the political line of the organization and controls its application from top to bottom. That in the world have permanent monopoly of the job of leadership. The expression of opinion only has limited value once the pay the group function prevents the opinion from the forming of a solid base, i.e., permanent participation in the organization's activity and the solution of problems that arise. If the way the organization is run makes the solution for general problem, specific tasks and permanent work of separate category of militants only the opinion will, or will appear to counter the other. And this is why this central party where the leader is in charge of everything, there is no democratic oversight within the party. In fact, if there are many examples of this style of government, does not work. It goes against both science and the people defending, whatever opinion that goes against their interests. This is why we especially change, especially North Korea and other countries similar, because the very concept of a centralized government is antithetical to freedom itself. As Enrique Malatesta said it once, government, there is a group of people entrusted with making laws and empowerment to use the collective power to oblige each individual to obey them. Is already a privileged class and cut off from the people. As any continued body would do, it would instinctively seek to extend its power to be beyond public control, to impose its own policies, and to give priority to its special interests. Having been of a previous position, the government is already at odds with the people whose strength is disposed of. In fact, people forget that many experts who study North Korea professionally have admitted that it's not even socialist, it's more like a state capitalist monarchy. So anybody who defends it is not doing that. They even have businesses outside of that using capitalism to pay $60 million a year for the Kim regime. And let's not forget there are times where we had blamed North Korea for their own aggression. A most infamous example if they would be when they bombed the island in South Korea. They did an other crash in 2010 with the Yeonpyeong-dong bombardment. It's a large artillery attacks on that island in both military and civilian targets, which resulted in death of 4 South Koreans. It's one of the most serious clashes in the Korean War. And now America's occupation went Iran, and they removed the defense equipment. Now North Korea, who originally told you they wanted peace and they were willing to remove nuclear weapons, and they will have a good relation with Trump and Kim Il Sung because they're both authoritarian dictators, right? But now because Trump made fun of him and remove whatever peace they have, they're like, you know what? Fuck it, we gotta become the thing you want us to become to begin with, removing whatever revolutionary potential you do have. And let's not forget they are supporting fascism as well. They're supporting fascist Russian invasion of Ukraine, and they even participate in this fascist aggression. So don't get the illusion that North Korea is some ideal socialist thing. It is a capitalist monarchy. Never forget that. I'm gonna put a shit down links in description and sources to show you what it's actually like in North Korea, both positive and negative.